Curators restored a faded portrait from 1875. Three brothers reappeared in haunting detail. But behind them stood a fourth figure, tall, looming, and with no face at all. Daniel Hartwell had always been drawn to forgotten things. As the newly appointed curator of the Millbrook Historical Society, he spent his days breathing life back into dusty artifacts and faded photographs that others had deemed worthless. The old Victorian mansion that housed the collection creaked and groaned around him, its walls lined with the memories of a town that had seen better days. On this particular October morning, the autumn light filtered through grimy windows as Daniel carefully unpacked a donation from the recently deceased estate of Eleanor Blackwood, Millbrook's oldest resident. Among the usual assortment of china dolls and tarnished silverware, his fingers found something that made him pause. A daguerreotype in an ornate silver frame, its surface clouded with age and neglect. The photograph showed three young men, brothers by their resemblance, standing stiffly in formal Victorian attire, against what appeared to be the parlor of a grand home. Their faces were solemn, their eyes fixed on the camera with the intensity common to early photography. But something about the image troubled Daniel in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. Perhaps it was the way the shadows fell across their faces, or the strange quality of light that seemed to emanate from behind them. He carried the photograph to his restoration station, where powerful LED lights and magnifying equipment waited. As he began the delicate process of cleaning the glass and adjusting the contrast digitally, the image slowly began to reveal its secrets. What emerged made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. Behind the three brothers, barely visible in the original print, but becoming clearer with each adjustment, stood a fourth figure. The man was tall and gaunt, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend with the shadows of the room. But where his face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless oval, as if someone had deliberately obscured his features, or as if the very emulsion of the photograph had rejected his presence. Daniel rubbed his eyes, certain he was seeing things, but the figure remained, growing more distinct with each enhancement. The man's hands rested on the shoulders of the middle brother, and there was something possessive, almost threatening about the gesture. Daniel's academic mind raced through possible explanations. Photography errors were common in the 1870s. Double exposures, chemical mishaps, light leaks could all create strange artifacts. But this felt different. The figure was too deliberate, too precisely positioned to be an accident. He began researching the photograph's provenance, diving into Eleanor Blackwood's family records and the historical archives of Millbrook. What he found sent a chill down his spine. The three brothers were the Ashford family, Marcus, Theodore, and James, sons of the town's most prominent merchant family. According to newspaper records from 1875, all three brothers had died within 6 months of each other under mysterious circumstances. Marcus had drowned in the town's mill pond, despite being an accomplished swimmer. Theodore had fallen from his horse on a road he had traveled countless times. James had simply vanished one winter night, leaving behind only his coat hanging on a fence post near the old cemetery. The coincidences were too numerous to ignore, and Daniel found himself pulled deeper into the mystery with each passing hour. He discovered that the Ashford family had been involved in some kind of business dispute in the months before their deaths, something involving a partnership that had gone sour and accusations of betrayal. There were hints of a fourth partner, someone whose name had been carefully scrubbed from official records, but whose presence seemed to linger in the margins of every document Daniel uncovered. As the day wore on, and the shadows lengthened in his office, Daniel became increasingly aware of a feeling he couldn't shake, the sensation of being watched. Every time he looked up from his research, his eyes were drawn to the photograph, where the faceless figure seemed to loom larger, more present, as if the very act of discovery was awakening something that had long been dormant. When the cleaning staff arrived that evening, they found Daniel still hunched over his desk, surrounded by scattered documents and photocopies, his face pale in the glow of his computer screen. He barely acknowledged their presence, muttering about patterns and connections, about a mystery that grew more complex with each piece of evidence he uncovered. As the custodian, Mrs. Chen, later told her husband, there was something different about Mr. Hartwell that night, something intense and almost fevered about the way he clutched that old photograph. She had worked in the museum for 15 years and had seen curators become obsessed with their research before, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. As she locked up the building and walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her from the upstairs windows, though she knew Daniel had left hours earlier. That photograph, she whispered to herself as she drove away. There's something very wrong with that photograph. Daniel's weekend was consumed by the mystery of the faceless man. He had taken high-resolution photographs of the daguerreotype and spent hours analyzing every pixel, every shadow, every subtle gradation of tone. The more he studied the image, the more convinced he became that the fourth figure was not a photographic anomaly, but a deliberate addition. Someone who had been present when the photograph was taken, but whose identity had been systematically erased from history. His apartment became a makeshift investigation headquarters, with printouts, genealogy charts, and historical documents covering every available surface. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of shadowy figures and faceless watchers who seemed to follow him through the labyrinthine corridors of his subconscious. Monday morning found him back at the Historical Society before dawn, determined to uncover the truth behind the Ashford family tragedy. He began by examining every photograph, document, and artifact related to the family, looking for any trace of the mysterious fourth man. In a ledger from the Ashford textile mill, he discovered references to a silent partner known only as H. Voss, someone who had invested heavily in the business, but whose name appeared on no official documents or partnership agreements. The entries suggested that Voss had some kind of hold over the family, providing capital for their ventures, but demanding an unusually high degree of control over their operations. More disturbing were the personal notes Marcus Ashford had written in the margins of his journal, cryptic references to the Watcher and the man who sees all but shows nothing. Daniel's research led him to the Millbrook Cemetery, where the Ashford family mausoleum stood like a small Gothic cathedral among the weathered headstones. The structure was more elaborate than most, with intricate carvings and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the marble floors within. But as Daniel studied the inscriptions and dates, he noticed something peculiar. The mausoleum had been designed to hold 4 bodies, not 3. There was an empty niche clearly intended for another family member, but no name or date marked its intended occupant. The groundskeeper, an elderly man named Tucker, who had worked at the cemetery for 40 years, remembered hearing stories about the Ashford family from his predecessor. According to local legend, the family had been cursed by a business partner they had cheated, someone who had sworn to follow them beyond the grave. The breakthrough came when Daniel discovered a hidden compartment in Eleanor Blackwood's donation, a secret drawer in an antique writing desk that contained a collection of letters and documents that had been carefully preserved for over a century. Among them was a confession written by Theodore Ashford, just days before his death. A rambling, increasingly frantic account of events that painted a picture of guilt, paranoia, and supernatural terror. According to Theodore's account, The Ashford brothers had indeed cheated their business partner, Heinrich Voss, out of his rightful share of a lucrative government contract. But Voss had not simply accepted defeat. Instead, he had begun a campaign of psychological warfare, appearing at unexpected moments, watching from shadows, making his presence known without ever confronting them directly. The brothers had tried to buy him off, threatened him, even attempted to have him arrested. But Voss seemed untouchable, protected by connections and resources they couldn't understand. Theodore's final entries described a man who seemed to exist between the world of the living and the dead, someone who could be present without being seen, who could influence events without leaving evidence of his involvement. The brothers had become convinced that Voss was using some form of dark knowledge or supernatural power to torment them, that he had found a way to exist in the spaces between reality, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to claim his revenge. The last entry, written in a shaking hand, described how Voss had approached Theodore directly for the first time, speaking in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "He told me that death would not release us from our debt," Theodore had written. "He said that he would follow us into whatever comes after, that he would be there waiting when our children's children drew their first breath. He has found a way to make himself eternal, and he has bound our family to him forever." As Daniel read these words by the fading light of his office lamp, he became aware of a change in the atmosphere around him. The usual sounds of the old building, the settling of wood, the whisper of air through ancient vents, seemed to have fallen silent. The photograph on his desk seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the faceless figure appearing to lean forward, as if straining to escape the confines of the frame. Daniel's rational mind told him that he was letting the mystery consume him, that he was seeing patterns and connections that existed only in his imagination. But another part of him, a deeper and more primitive part, recognized the truth that Theodore Ashford had discovered too late. Some debts transcend death, and some watchers never stop watching. "I understand now," Daniel whispered to the empty room, "why Eleanor Blackwood kept these documents hidden for so long." The revelation came not in the dusty archives or crumbling documents, but in Daniel's own reflection as he worked late one evening in the Historical Society's restoration lab. He had been enhancing another photograph from the Blackwood collection, a group portrait of Millbrook's founding families taken in 1890, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the group, partially obscured by shadow, but unmistakably present, was the same tall, gaunt figure he had discovered in the Ashford photograph. But this time, the man's face was visible, and Daniel found himself staring into features that were disturbingly familiar. The eyes were his own eyes, the jawline identical to the one he saw in the mirror each morning, the distinctive scar above the left eyebrow, a perfect match for the mark Daniel had carried since childhood. The implications crashed over him like a physical blow. Daniel stumbled backward from his workstation, his mind reeling as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving fell into place with terrifying precision. Eleanor Blackwood hadn't donated her collection randomly. She had specifically requested that it be given to Daniel Hartwell, the new curator, the man who bore an uncanny resemblance to someone who should have been dead for over a century. His own family history, which he had always assumed was lost to time and immigration records, suddenly took on a sinister new dimension. The adoption papers he had discovered in his teenage years, the gaps in his genealogy, the strange dreams that had haunted him since childhood. All of it pointed to a connection he had never wanted to acknowledge. Daniel's frantic research into his own background revealed the truth that had been carefully hidden by generations of bureaucracy and deliberate obfuscation. He was not merely related to Heinrich Voss. He was Heinrich Voss, reborn into each generation of his bloodline, carrying the memories and hatred of his original incarnation like a genetic curse. The early photographs showed him not as a supernatural entity, but as a man who had discovered how to transfer his consciousness, his very essence, from one body to another through the generations of his own descendants. Each time his current form died, he would be reborn into the next generation, carrying with him the accumulated knowledge and burning desire for revenge that had driven him for over a century. The faceless appearance in the Ashford photograph was not a photographic anomaly. It was a transitional state, the moment when Voss was moving between incarnations, when his essence was not yet fully settled into its new form. Daniel understood now why he had always felt drawn to forgotten things, why he had an inexplicable talent for uncovering hidden truths, why he could sometimes sense the weight of history in ways that others could not. He was the collector of debts, the keeper of grudges, the watcher who had been following the Ashford bloodline through time, waiting for the moment when he could claim the ultimate revenge. But there was a horrible irony in his situation. While he had retained the memories and purpose of Heinrich Voss, he had also developed the personality and moral compass of Daniel Hartwell, creating a war within himself between justice and vengeance, between his human compassion and his supernatural hunger for retribution. The realization that he was both hunter and hunted, predator and victim, sent Daniel into a spiral of existential terror. He was not merely investigating a mystery. He was the mystery, the faceless man who had haunted the Ashford family and countless others over the decades. The deaths of Marcus, Theodore, and James had not been accidents or coincidences. They had been carefully orchestrated by previous incarnations of himself, guided by the same inexorable drive for revenge that now pulsed through his veins. But unlike his predecessors, Daniel retained enough of his human identity to be horrified by what he was becoming, what he had always been. He understood now why Eleanor Blackwood had preserved the documents and photographs. She had been the last surviving descendant of the Ashford line, and she had spent her life trying to understand the curse that had followed her family through generations. As Daniel sat alone in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his own supernatural nature, he felt the familiar sensation of being watched intensify into something almost unbearable. But now he understood the truth. He was not being watched by some external entity. He was watching himself, his consciousness split between the personality he had developed as Daniel Hartwell and the primordial hatred that defined Heinrich Voss. The faceless man in the photograph was not looking at the Ashford brothers. He was looking forward through time, directly at Daniel, knowing that eventually they would be one and the same person. The Watcher had been waiting patiently for over a century, and now, finally, it was time for the circle to close. "I am both the question and the answer," Daniel whispered into the darkness, "both the seeker and the sought." The choice that faced Daniel was unlike anything a human being should ever have to confront. He could embrace his true nature as Heinrich Voss, allowing the centuries of accumulated hatred to consume what remained of his human identity, and completing the revenge that had been planned for so long. Eleanor Blackwood had died childless, but she had not been the last of the Ashford bloodline. Daniel's research had revealed distant cousins, great-grandchildren of relatives who had fled Millbrook in the wake of the original tragedy. people who carried the Ashford name and blood without knowing the curse that followed them. The supernatural entity within him whispered that it would be simple to track them down, to continue the cycle of carefully orchestrated deaths that had claimed so many over the decades. All he had to do was stop fighting his true nature and let Heinrich Voss take complete control. But Daniel Hartwell had lived 34 years as a human being, had formed connections, developed empathy, learned to value life in ways that Heinrich Voss had forgotten in his centuries of obsession. The thought of becoming a murderer, even in service of some cosmic justice, filled him with revulsion. He spent days locked in his office, neither eating nor sleeping, as he wrestled with the fundamental question of identity. Was he, Daniel Hartwell, possessed by the spirit of Heinrich Voss? Or was he Heinrich Voss who had deluded himself into believing he was someone else? The answer, he realized, might determine not only his own fate, but the fate of everyone connected to the Ashford bloodline. The photographs and documents spread across his desk seemed to mock him with their silent testimony to decades of death and suffering, all orchestrated by versions of himself he could barely remember. The resolution came not through any grand gesture or supernatural intervention, but through a simple act of human choice. Daniel gathered every photograph, document, and artifact related to the Ashford Voss mystery, and methodically destroyed them all. He fed the daguerreotype into an industrial shredder, watching as the faceless man who had haunted him was reduced to tiny fragments of silver and glass. He burned the letters, the journals, the genealogy charts, and Eleanor Blackwood's carefully preserved confessions, watching as centuries of evidence went up in flames. Most importantly, he destroyed his own research, every digital file, and printed document that could lead someone else down the same dark path he had traveled. The act of destruction felt like an exorcism, each burning page releasing him a little more from the grip of his supernatural heritage. With the physical evidence destroyed, Daniel made his final choice. He resigned from his position at the Historical Society, liquidated his assets, and disappeared from Millbrook as completely as if he had never existed. But unlike Heinrich Voss's previous vanishing acts, this departure was not a strategic retreat. It was a deliberate severance of the cycle that had defined his existence for over a century. He moved to a small coastal town where nobody knew his name or his history, took a job as a lighthouse keeper where his only responsibility was to guide ships safely to harbor rather than lure them onto the rocks. The solitude gave him time to think, to separate the memories that belonged to Heinrich Voss from the experiences that defined Daniel Hartwell, to slowly but deliberately starve the supernatural entity within him of the hatred and obsession that had sustained it for so long. Years passed in this self-imposed exile, and Daniel gradually felt the weight of his inherited curse begin to lift. The memories of Heinrich Voss faded like dreams upon waking, becoming stories he had heard rather than experiences he had lived. He learned to find peace in simple things, the rhythm of the waves, the cry of seabirds, the satisfaction of maintaining equipment that saved lives rather than took them. He never married, never had children, understanding that the curse might still be passed on to future generations if he were not careful. But he found a different kind of fulfillment in his work, in the knowledge that his light guided travelers safely home rather than leading them into danger. The photographs he took now were of sunrises and storms, of ships appearing on the horizon, and families reuniting on the docks, images of hope and connection, rather than secrets and shadows. On his 60th birthday, Daniel received a package with no return address. Inside was a modern photograph, a family portrait taken at some recent celebration. The faces were unfamiliar, but something about their features triggered a deep recognition. These were Ashford descendants, he realized, the distant relatives he had once planned to hunt down. But they looked happy, healthy, surrounded by children and grandchildren, who would grow up free from the curse that had defined their ancestors. There was no faceless man lurking in the shadows behind them, no supernatural watcher following their every move. The cycle had been broken not through violence or revenge, but through the simple human choice to refuse the call of inherited hatred. Daniel smiled as he looked at their faces, then carefully placed the photograph in his fireplace and watched it burn. Some stories, he had learned, were meant to end rather than continue. The Watcher, he said quietly to himself, as the flames consumed the last evidence of his former life, has finally learned to look away.